Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are glad you are here with us, and just by showing up today, you're already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, I'm pleased to feature an old friend along with a new one, but both are highly accomplished global music executives whose working relationship spans over 25 years. They were digital long before digital was cool, and they worked on many of my favorite all-time artists and records. Many of those names we will review shortly. I promise you will leave today thinking, wow, who knew? And you'll also leave smarter and more inspired than you arrived. Before we get started, please let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Many of you know that I'm a music industry headhunter. I run the music practice at Turnkey ZRG, and I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and please make some new ones. And ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those as possible during the interview itself. Also, please make sure your chat is set to address everyone, not just the speakers. I want to thank our program sponsors, for without their support, we could not keep this series free. Special thank you to First Horizon Bank, Turnkey ZRG, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, MedJet, Tennessee Brew Works, Project Music, and Cushmaster's brand of CBE products. Now, let's get down to business. In today's host seat, we welcome back my good friend and frequent contributor to this platform, Dick Huey. Dick is a Pacific Northwest-based music consultant whose professional career began at the Beggars Group in the role of global head of digital in 1997. He launched his New York City-based digital marketing consultancy called Toolshed in 2002, creating groundbreaking digital campaigns for many of the world's top independent labels and artists. In 2010, Toolshed expanded into music rights acquisition for consumer brands, media, tech, sports, and entertainment companies, including Spotify, prior to its US launch in 2011. He's currently a business development consultant to AIMS API, an artificial intelligence music search platform based in the Czech Republic, as well as Entertainment Intelligence, a high-end music analytics platform for direct license content owners. He is a music license consultant to the US independent record label Merge Records and an advisor to the personal social media monetization platform OKTY. Outside of the music industry, Dick is a senior teaching assistant at NYU Professor Scott Galloway's two-year educational sprint startup called Section 4. He held a 9-year board seat at Sound Exchange representing Matador Records. He is a past executive director and board chairman of the Future of Music Coalition based in Washington, D.C. Welcome back, my good friend.
Thank you, sir.
Joining Dick as today's featured guest is Simon Wheeler. Previously a musician, engineer, producer, remixer, and promoter, Simon has been with the Beggars Group since 1990. Starting with online distribution in 1997, Simon has since worked with almost every significant entity in digital media, testified to both US and UK governments, and has spoken at most media conferences around the world on digital music and media strategy. He is also a board member of Video Performance Limited, but the most important role is keeping the Beggars Group of labels at the forefront of all new technologies to deliver its roster of artists to the widest possible audiences. The Beggars Group represents 4AD, Matador, Rough Trade, XL Recordings, and Young Recordings. It is an honor to welcome these two rock stars to our platform. Please take it away, Dick.
Thank you very much, Tom. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. It's great to be here, Simon. It's great to be doing this with you. People have said to me before that there are two Simons, that there's the Simon who I think of as sort of an iconoclast, Simon who is interested in wine, who's interested in music, who's done a lot of work in music, who loves to garden. And then there's the Simon who some of the people who are watching this will probably know, which is a nails tough negotiator on behalf of the Beggars Group. And we're going to explore both parts of those today. I'd like to actually have you start by taking us back to the start. I'm curious if music was a focus for you right out of the gate. I mean, did you know that music was going to be your thing, or was it something that it took you a long time to come to?
Thanks, Dick, and thanks, Tom, for having me on this. I'm looking forward to catching up. Dick's just one of my oldest standing colleagues and personal friends. So I'm just looking forward to this chat. Hopefully, it's going to be interesting for folks. But I mean, back in the day, at the real start when I was a kid, I mean, it was my mum's record collection which kind of kicked everything off. She was in London. She was working in London as a young nurse in the 60s when it was all happening, and her record collection, which was kind of like built out of the late 50s, so lots of like Buddy Holly, Bill Haley, bit of Elvis, Jerry Lewis. All of those classic rock and roll tunes, and then coming into the 60s with the Beatles. She had the first Beatles records, and her gift to me and to my other brothers and sister was to pass on her collection and use that to introduce us to music. And I think just from hearing those records, hearing my mum talking about being a young person in the 60s in London when it was really happening, seeing the Beatles emerge, and just kind of like hearing that excitement. That was definitely the genesis of my, interest in music. And pretty much from that time on, I, played a bunch of records at school, a bunch of different musical instruments at school, and as soon as I could, we were making a band together with friends at like 12 or 13, and we were playing Buddy Holly songs. Actually, that was really how the band started, and we were writing songs. Me and a friend, we definitely saw ourselves as a bit of a, sort of like a Buddy Holly style songs. Then going on to, we definitely fancied ourselves as a bit of a Lennon McCartney as well. But I mean, yeah, from an early age, it was all about music. That's kind of not all I was interested in, but that was my main focus. Everything was about music, playing music, listening to music, talking about music. And yeah, many years on, I'm kind of still doing a lot of these things. I'm not playing so much music nowadays, but it's still like a big obsession in my life. There's no doubt about that.
All right, you hit on a whole bunch of things, and we're going to touch on some of those later on. By the way, something I forgot to say at the start of this. At the end of this session, we're going to do a speed round with Simon. And in that speed round, I am going to ask him quick questions, which he's going to answer with the first thing that comes to mind. I would like to invite everybody that's watching this to drop into the chat your quick question for Simon. Please don't make it be about why he hasn't licensed your startup or something like that. But help me out and give me what you'd like to find out about Simon in a quick ask at the end of this. So going back, Simon, to what you said. So you started out in a family with a mother who is very musical. And as far as the step that got you into actually playing in a band, was there something seminal in your town? Was there a place in your town where you where you met these other musicians and spent time?
Well, I mean, it was it was a kind of medium-sized town, about an hour outside London. It's definitely sort of like, commuters type of bill in many ways. It was a pretty sort of fairly dull sort of town. But the one exception that it did have, which I didn't get to till I was well into my teens to be old enough to go there, was a music club called Friars. And Friars Club billed itself as the biggest music club in Europe. I'm not quite sure why it was Europe or anything like that, but it was a 25 pence life membership. You had to buy a membership to go into the club. So everyone that went in, whoever it was, had to buy the membership, hence why it was probably the biggest music club in Europe. It was run by a fantastic guy who's still around in the business called David Stopps. He's really involved in the Music Managers Forum and is still, really working with hard on representing artists' rights. But that club was just kind of, when I think back about it now, I mean, the fact that like a suburban town can have a club where literally everyone went to play. Maybe it was a warm-up show for their tour if they were a big band. So I remember queuing up for tickets like for the Police when they were kind of at the peak of their powers. They were just doing warm-up shows for like Zenyatta Mondatta at the time. Genesis did warm-up shows there. Howard Jones and Marillion were the local bands. I mean, they were both from the area and they kind of carved their career out there. And David Stopps was and still does manage Howard, to this day. So seeing those local artists come up and actually achieve like real huge, worldwide success out of this kind of like, conservative suburban town. I think one of the biggest claims of fame to Friars was that David Bowie did the first ever Ziggy Stardust there. He launched Ziggy Stardust, in my local town. I was like 8 years old or something like that at the time. I was far too young to know, but I did actually, get to see one of those tickets, and it's an iconic moment to be associated with. So anyway, the fact that club was there, and every week they had people who are, seriously at the top of their game, The Clash, Talking Heads, Blondie. I mean, it was kind of everyone played there apart from Elvis and the Stones. It's kind of what you're thinking, because it was that kind of a place. Human League in the 80s was when they hit number one. It was the day that they played at Friars Aylesbury, and sort of like moments like that was, it's just part of what got you really so excited about music, about how buzzy and about how amazing it could be. So, I was super lucky to have that on my doorstep, and I absolutely took advantage of it. You had to be 16 to go in, and I'm pretty sure I went there when I was 14.
That was going to be my next question: is when you went to your first show.
Well,
and were any of them beggar shows? I mean, do you remember seeing any beggars bands during that time?
Let's have a think. I mean, Gary Newman would have played there. Bauhaus absolutely played there a few times. Actually, that would have been probably the one which stuck in my head. But yeah, Cocteau Twins played that. I mean, kind of everyone played there with that. It was just part of the circuit which existed at the time, which sadly is kind of, not much of it left nowadays. But yeah, when you could see bands of such that, it's about a 1,200 capacity venue, so it wasn't the biggest, but for a regional show and seeing these bands, Talking Heads, oh my God, just thinking about these things now, I can see the posters, I can see the ticket, I can visualize the show. We were just so lucky to have that there, and it was definitely key to my, fueling the passion, which was already burning away pretty brightly.
Good. So let's actually head back to that for a second. The band piece of what you were doing. So band started out for you as a bit of fun, and pretty quickly became serious. And from my recollection, it was the band that had something to do with you connecting initially with Beggars at All, or do I have that wrong? Why don't you explain?
Yeah. It's a bit of a strange chronology, really. But it was definitely, running my band, trying to, work out how you get signed, trying to sort of build that into something. And one of the moves I made was actually working for it's like a distribution company who distributed pressing plants and, CD plants, but largely vinyl at the time, but also starting to do CD. And I took that job on the basis that they were going to be delivering to record companies, and I could get to know people at record companies and, maybe be able to get myself a deal with my band. So, one of the companies, amongst many was Beggars and 4AD, and, delivering records there. I bumped into someone that I was at school with. He was in the year above me at school, kind of knew each other, not well, but enough to know who each other were, and just hanging out and sort of talking there, getting to know people. And, one day he's like, should you fancy your job? So-and-so's leaving in 2 weeks' time. And I'm going, yeah, I could be interested. And he said, well, here's a phone number, give Martin a ring, and have a chat. And, you know, I called this number, spoke to Martin. I wasn't really aware about who Martin was, that Martin Mills, this is. And you know, called him up and said, yeah, I'd love to come and work for you. You know, absolutely up for doing anything you want. You know, just ask me, I'll do it. And he's like, okay, start in 2 weeks, yeah. And you know, how much you gonna get paid? And I was talking to him about this last night. £11,000 a year was the salary to start, and it's like, yeah, whatever it is, you know, I'm fine, I'm good. I'm in. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
I'll pay you to work here.
So, well, it was kind of like that, yeah. So I mean, that was the start to get to know, you know, trying to get to know people to get the band signed, which actually led to me starting to work at Beggars, which was packing boxes in the warehouse and you know, doing whatever else was kind of like needed around the place. And then, you know, a few years later, actually, my band did get signed by Beggars, which, you know, clearly was just so kind of like fortunate. And Martin and Roger Trust, the A&R at the time, was you know, I was dragging them out to see the shows. Come and see my band. Come and see my band. Come and see my band. And they did actually give me, you know, sort of like gave me a small deal, and we put out a few records. But you know, no one's going to know the band because we really didn't sell any records.
Yeah, but they want to know the name of it, Simon. Yeah. So you need to drop the name. You can even type in the chat if you want to.
Well, it was a band called C Sensi. I mean, you know, in terms of being unsuccessful artists, we ticked every box on that one. And there we go, we put it in there. You know, if anyone wants to listen, it's, of course, you know, there's an EP on all the key services. I will know if you listen, because it will obviously boost my listener count by a fairly high percentage if anyone listens to it. And I shall obviously be tracking my royalty statement through and bugging the hell out of the royalties people at Beggars, which will go down a treat as well. But yeah, so I mean, you know, really didn't get anywhere. I put my kind of life and soul into that for so long. And I think when that just didn't work, you know, it didn't connect. We didn't sell any records, nothing was happening. And I kind of made the assumption, well, the kind of in my head, it's like, well, okay, I gave that a go for a large part of my life. I mean, you know, for like 10, 15 years, that was my entire focus. I got there, you know, I got to do a lot of stuff, recorded in some great studios in the BBC and Maida Vale, toured Europe. Loads of cool stuff. Got signed by one of the most amazing record labels in the world. It didn't work out. I tried, but I was kind of thought I was probably better at the business side of things than I was at the music side of things, and sort of turned my attention to that. Beggars said, you know, I'm kind of done with the music side, so what have you got? And, you know, and then it started.
And as it turned out, there was a lot. So let's talk about, let's transition over to the work side of Beggars, and you starting in the warehouse, which just reminds me of so many stories I've heard, you know, through the years of, oh, you know, he started in the mailroom, or she started in the, you know, doing whatever it is, bringing coffee. When you start at the basement, and you were literally in the basement, I remember the first time I went into the Beggars vinyl and CD vault, and just about my jaw dropped, and I probably spent 2 hours just looking at what was there. It was incredible. And you got to work there, which is amazing to me. And it was also an interesting time, because that was the time where, you know, you were transitioning in the industry from cassettes and vinyl to CDs. So what do you remember about that time, about those really early days at Beggars? And, you know, memories, work memories or band memories? You know, what sticks in your head from those early years?
Yeah, well, I mean, being surrounded by so much music, I mean, I think, you know, being the type of kid I was at the time, I mean, it was, you know, you just couldn't be in a more exciting place. So I mean, I literally did ransack, go through the entire catalogue and make sure I kind of like knew what was going on, and I wanted to hear everything, listen to everything. I probably wanted a copy of everything at home as well. You know, being the obsessive sort of record collector on top of everything else, obsessive about music. Yeah, it's the start of CDs were really kind of like coming in and transitioning from vinyl at that time. Definitely preferred CDs to vinyl at that particular point in time, because they were so much lighter to lift. You know, I mean, I was in the warehouse for like, you know, best part of 10 years. You know, really, obviously, the kind of like the type of work changed over the time. I think probably like the biggest memory sort of band wise was when we well, there's a couple actually. One where we did doing This Mortal Coil, and we didn't, or 4AD didn't license like the vinyl to local licensees, but actually we sold all that through export companies, but sold it all from the UK. So getting all of that vinyl in, I mean, and that was Blood. It was their third album. It was a big kind of like thick sort of double disc set. So you weren't getting many of those in the boxes and deluxe editions and that type of stuff. And I remember just filling up the entire warehouse with like This Mortal Coil stuff, because, you know, it was just every possible space we were having boxes so that we could ship it out. And I can't remember quite how many we did there, but that was like a big memory there. And then the second one was Prodigy, Fat of the Land. You know, that was
Slow down on Prodigy.
Global.
We're gonna get to Prodigy in a minute. You're going too fast.
Well, you know, there's these things. I think with the Prodigy, we did like, you know, I do remember it. It was 216,000 copies of that vinyl album that I shipped out of that warehouse. And at that time, there wasn't really anyone else much helping out. You know, I was trying to drag the people out to unload some of the lorries when we had a big one in, but yeah, I mean, you know, that number stuck in my head because I lifted a lot of boxes doing that stuff.
That's a lot of boxes. That's a lot of music. All right, so we're going to come back to that in a second, but before we get there, what do you remember about the mix at that time? So, you know, at that time, that was if you will, the heyday of 4AD with Ivor Watts Russell. It was the XL was still, correct me if I have this wrong because I wasn't around there then, but as I understand it, it was a pretty small club label at that point. What other memories stick in your mind about the sort of label structure that was going on before Fat of the Land hit?
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, it was kind of like prime 4AD time. You know, when I started in 1990. The records, you know, the first records you were doing, you're starting there, just going, okay, so you've got Bossa Nova by the Pixies, you've got Heaven of Las Vegas by the Cocteau Twins, you had the Charlatans UK album, which is huge in the UK, it's #1 album. It, you know, wasn't so big in America, but kind of like massive in the UK and Europe. So you've got these like, you know, looking back on it, just absolutely iconic albums of those time, and it's like, yeah, well, what's in this week, guys? Band the Pixies. Oh, right, okay. Any good. So you know, 4AD was absolutely, you know, singing. I was fortunate enough to, you know, be there when Ivo was running it, and he was really good and kind to me. He was a bit of a, you know, sort of like a stern and slightly scary character, really, but actually at heart he was just such a lovely guy. Again, was just really passionate about music and just loves and still does, you know, love music. So I was fortunate enough to be, you know, to be working with him to some degree. And but also 4AD, it was you know, Vaughan Oliver and Chris Bigg at V23 doing the artwork and design, which, you know, I think was such a unique partnership between them and Ivo. You know, to make 4AD what it was, you know, the art and design was almost as important as the music. I think it's certainly, you know, very close there, and I think they were very unique as a label in doing that. And Vaughan and Chris had a studio like right next to the warehouse, so you know, again, having that kind of interaction. You know, I look back on it now, they're such incredible people. I mean, Vaughan sadly passed, you know, a few years ago, but Chris Bigg is still around. But literally being next door to the, you know, these creative geniuses, you know, and the art side of things, and seeing what they were doing and the work in the dark room, and, you know, they were just brilliantly creative people. So that was pretty special. XL, as you say, was just kind of like starting up. They were this like, you know, kind of small rave label, which was based in the post room under reception. You know, it was a tiny thing that I don't think many people in the company really took too seriously or even understood what they were doing in those early days. You know, and Beggars at that time was kind of releasing, you know, records by artists who had previously been on the label. So, you know, Peter Murphy, Danny Ash from Bauhaus, or sort of like doing things with Grant McLennan and Robert Forster from the Go-Betweens, and Situation 2 was kind of like the more sort of alternative, really, where the heart was, who'd signed the Charlatans and a number of other really sort of more interesting and more cutting edge acts. And yeah, so it's definitely quite a different dynamic at that point in time. And I think that was it for the labels at the time. I mean, at that stage.
Yep, and of course, the person we haven't talked about too much yet, and we don't have to go super into this, but Martin Mills, right there in the middle of all of it, along with all the other amazing label heads and individuals that you mentioned, is just must have been a remarkable time to come up into the system, which at that time was that was pretty early days. So there were a lot of international licensees, if I remember correctly, and
yeah.
international licensees, and also licensing of catalog to bigger labels, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that was what and how an indie label worked, in those days, and for a lot of people, it kind of still is. You were kind of trying to pick licensees in each territory that could make your music available. I mean, a lot of licensing to majors. Vegas never did too many sort of like multi-territory deals with majors. I think there were possibly one or two, but not many. But it was literally trying to handpick partners in each territory, and from the warehouse, they certainly wouldn't be manufacturing a lot of these things, so we're sending them finished stock, which as I learned was a great way of running the business and getting the money in, because you were selling things direct, finished product to people, on whatever it was, 30-day terms or whatever the terms were, rather than waiting for a licensee to be accounting to you a couple of times a year. So actually that flow of sales, both to export companies and to licensees, which the warehouse was in charge of at Beggars, and we did all that direct. That was kind of keeping the lights on, really. But it was one of the many things which I've learned from Martin over the years, because he's such a astute businessman, as well as being one of the world's biggest music fans.
Yeah.
And just the way that he approached running the company, he's very careful, he's very thoughtful, and made a business work. And it was not easy, even in those sort of early days, there have been successes, some significant successes. But it was still a bit of a trouble, keeping the company running, solvent, let alone sort of like profitable, signing artists, finding great artists and making that music available. So, the kind of export business for Beggars was one of the first things. It's okay, it's cash flow, it's getting that money in, seeing that it would be taking so much longer to come through a licensee system. So one of many things which I've learned from Martin over the years.
So interesting. Yeah. So this time period we're talking about, which is right before Fat of the Line, is right when I signed my first band to Beggars, and that was what brought me into the universe of Beggars, and meeting you at some point in that journey, a couple of years into it, probably after the band had imploded. Unfortunately, that was June.
That was June. Yeah, that was right.
June.
Yeah. God, I can even remember the catalog number. Sadly, I mean, it is like that's kind of how it is.
Too much useless information in your head.
10 years in the warehouse. I mean, it's stuck. It's stuck. You do know the catalog numbers of everything. I mean, it's kind of sad in some ways, but yeah, that's just how it is.
Yeah. Well, in any case, so right around the time, or a little bit after the time, that June came aboard, we started hearing bits and pieces about Fat of the Land, about Prodigy, and you don't have to go too into detail, because I want to get onto some other things too. But what was it like at that time? Going from a label that had some admittedly big artists and big releases, to an artist, or to a label with an artist that was a global #1 superstar. What was that like?
Oh, it was just like the most exciting thing in the world. I mean, to see the ascension of an artist that you were working for, to go from small amounts of a 12-inch into being kind of the hottest thing on the planet, and that album being one of the most anticipated, well, certainly the most anticipated album of that year by the time we did it. I mean, it was You know, you just couldn't have been more excited about it. I mean, the record, it was phenomenal. The record itself was just so exciting to listen to, and you know, hearing the first bars of that record,
Yeah.
you know, from the start, it's just one of the classic first tracks of an album, an intro of a first track ever. I mean, and just hear it, even thinking about it, makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You know,
Mine
even
too.
now, which is like, you know, however long ago that was, it's like 25 years ago, and I can still feel that excitement today. So, you know, I mean, just being a small part of that, you know, packing all the boxes and getting it out there, you know, it was kind of incredible. But then what was also happening at Beggars is that the the anticipation and the demand for that band and that album kind of enabled Martin and Paul Redding, who was running international at the time and is now the company CEO. It enabled them to sort of like rejig our sort of structure and way that we dealt with partners around the world. I think sort of like started to fundamentally shape Beggars into the company that it's kind of become over the years. I think that was just such an important moment. But you know, again, it's Martin sort of like savviness to know when you've got something that's kind of that hot to try and use that to leverage to, you know, to make things better in the future and put a good structure in place. So, you know, again, and being able to see that, you know, it wasn't me that was involved in it by any stretch of imagination, but certainly be able to see the sort of like workings of that again was a really, really important moment for me in the understanding about the importance of, you know, music all around the world, and the more control that you have, or you know, the more work that you do as part of this, and the more control that you have, you know, the better business it can make. So that's kind of driven a lot of my thinking that, you know, where we want to be, do we want, you know, who do we want to work with, and how do we want to work with them, and you know, what's the role for Beggars? And when I firmly believe that the best person to manage Beggars business is Beggars. So that's kind of the approach which I've taken, you know, to the licensing world in, you know, in many, many ways, because no one knows our business like us. And frankly, it's a bit of it's a bit of an optimist anyway. It's not like many other companies. So so it doesn't really fit into other people's models, you know, so well.
Yeah, gosh, you made me think of a ton of things I wanted to say. I mean, the time you're talking about was also the time when the US label started. It was the time when I was managing a second band. I'd signed to Beggars, and the marketing guy quit. Corey Brennan quit a few weeks, I think, was my recollection, before the record was supposed to come out. So that's how I got my first job there. And you know, what I remember about that time is all this change and all this excitement. On the US side of it, I remember a lot of big records that were still going through the major label licensing, like Prodigy, for instance, you know, went through Maverick. But and over those next several years, we started doing these we called them dog meetings, digital organization group meetings, and they involved usually me coming over and meeting with all of you. And you know, this is the time. I mean, this is pre Simon Wheeler, you know, setting your teeth into a new part of the business, the digital part of the business, which of course you've led for many, many years. So, you know, talk for a second about that time, and about, you know, the point at which you started putting together your vision for what the digital department at Beggars could become. That's probably a 5-year period, but just talk about a few memories of that period and what you were thinking at the time.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually more like a 10-year period, really, because I think, you know, when you were coming in and starting these conversations, it's such an early day. It was really, really early day. I mean, hardly anyone had email, and certainly in the UK. You know, I think 4AD was the first one to get an email, and there was, you know, a old computer sat in the middle of the room, which everyone's going, well, I don't know, what happens there? So it really was the very, very early days of digital, the early days of the internet. and dog, yeah, the dog meeting. I mean, Martin loves an acronym with with these things, and I think that just amused him. So that's what stuck. I think with you bringing in sort of like contacts, being in the US where it was clearly moving a lot faster, connectivity was becoming more sort of like prevalent in the US faster than it was in the UK. The first digital distribution companies were kind of popping up, and I think he kind of introduced us to Shakar, Amplified, and the folks at Liquid Audio at the time. I think Dick Wingate was probably around, wasn't he, around that sort of time?
Somewhere.
Yeah, and it was when it's me then. Comes up every January, and I was going to meet them doing the sort of international and sort of export sales business, meeting our partners on that on the physical side. And 1 year must have been like 96 or 97, I can't remember which. I mean, Martin's going, well, look, I've been introduced to these companies. They're doing this sort of digital distribution thing on the web. I think it could be quite interesting for us. About it. I was making music on my computer at the time, old Atari ST with a whole megabyte of RAM. That was absolutely the don at the time. And actually I was exchanging MIDI files with people. I was writing music sort of across the internet, so I kind of knew what it was to a certain degree. So he said, come along, you know a bit about this, and went and sat in these meetings and heard what everyone had to say. We come out and go, well, this is amazing. I mean, we just we always feel that if we can get our music in front of people, then lots of people will like it. In those days, the biggest problem that any label had was distribution. It's getting in front of people, particularly around the world. And these companies pitched the vision to us. It's like, okay, with digital distribution through us, we can make it available to everyone in the world directly. And that penny dropping at that time, as me and Martin were talking about it afterwards, was like, okay, but this is what we've been looking for here. This could be the vehicle where we can get all of these great artists that we love, that we're struggling to sort of like sell records of, or sort of get in front of people, or get our licensee in this country to do anything apart from work on the project. We can get all this stuff in front of people. We think this could be a real opportunity for us. And I might say, but if you think it's an opportunity and you're interested, why don't you pick it up and see what happens, see if there's anything there? And it turns out there was something there. But yeah, when it's that that was the kind of like the crystallizing.
That's a classic
moment.
Simon understatement.
But at that time, I think it was you really driving it. I mean, there you go. There's this thing happening on digital. This is what's new. This could be great for us. You were really kind of like beating that drum. With Leslie Bleakley, who run our US, or started our US operation and ran that for many years. You were kind of like, come on, Martin, this is the thing. And I'm not sure that whether sort of Leslie or Martin or anyone really kind of got it, but it was like, okay, well, let's see what happens. And I think Martin's always been really open to seeing what happens with different things and different technologies, even though he might not naturally be the person that leaps on things. So I think he's got just a broad enough mind, and to give people like you and me enough rope to hang ourselves, or is it to make something of it? I don't know, but
hang ourselves or make something with. Yeah, that's exactly. The just thinking about Martin's superpowers, and he has a lot of them. But the one that always stuck with me is what you were just talking about. It's this sort of unique ability to not even have to understand sort of the functional or technical underpinnings of a new platform or a new vision for the sharing of music or the disbursement of music or sale of music, but understanding where it fit in a business sense and how it could be articulated in a business sense. That was his superpower. And he had that right out of the gate, almost before I even knew what an MP3 was. I always thought, and I always felt this sort of sense of strength and confidence behind me, exploring too, but like a bit of this is how it feels like this is going to be positioned. So run with this idea and see how this works. And it sounds like you're describing something very similar in your experience with Martin, and maybe bring that forward a little bit more now. I'd like to, I guess, better understand how when Martin said to you, why don't you run with the ball a little bit? That meant some very specific things to you. You started traveling extensively in Asia and all over the world. I hardly know somebody who traveled more than you did. So talk about that, and maybe also now start to talk about your thinking about licensing deals at Beggars, and what your, I guess maybe what your approach is to bringing on new partners. Maybe start in the, I was going out in the rest of the world, and then maybe finish with, here's how I think about the digital space as far as Beggars and its historic catalog is concerned.
Okay, well, we'll have to see where I get to on that. If I get to off tangent, just
I'll bring it back.
But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as much as there was digital distribution which could get your music in front of anyone globally, you know, as a concept was right. You know, most of the companies in those days were from North America, from the US. Yes, global, but they were US companies that was just had a shop that was open globally. You know, there wasn't actually the local presence at that time. You know, not really that I could think of. But there were, you know, different markets were doing different things at different times. So I still had a little bit of my kind of like exporty, internationally sort of sales type of hat on, but you needed to really understand what was happening in the market rather than sitting in an office in London or New York or any other city and sort of trying to put your approach onto the market. Because I think if you do try and do that, then you're just going to miss a lot of opportunities, and maybe not even be able to have the conversations, you know, with the people in different territories. And I think if you're going to work directly with people and try and license, you know, these digital services which were popping up all over the world, you know, at that point in time, you've definitely got to understand where they're coming from. You've definitely got to, you know, understand their market, and you definitely got to be there to see them in person. You can't just rely on a meeting and me then to do it all, and you're kind of done. So you know, it was definitely fueled by the fact that I'm just sort of like super curious about you know, different cultures, certainly how music interfaces with different culture, music being culture itself. You know, and I kind of, you know, love the idea of traveling. I think that was in my blood. It's in my family's blood anyway. So I could tie these things which I love together, which was, you know, music, traveling, meeting interesting people, you know, learning about different, you know, and experiencing different cultures, and try and tie that together in a way which kind of worked for Beggars as a company. I mean, it was not a preconceived strategy. It definitely making things up as you're going along every day. Whatever come up, oh, right, how are we going to react to that? What we're going to do here? It was definitely busking it on many occasions, and you know, doing trips to the early days, you know, doing trips to somewhere like China back in the early days, you know, 2005, 2006, and going there and starting to do meetings with the companies at that time, because it was a 100% piracy market. The first digital companies had started up and were starting to be pretty significant there. It's with and where I met Ed Pito, and he was hatching his idea for Alpha Street, his company, to represent Western owners in China, who we worked with kind of ever since in the territory. But you know, going there and sort of meeting the first internet companies in China, who, you know, basically were either going, why do we need to deal with you? We got your music anyway. I mean, you know, what's all this about? Or basically just going, no one's interested in Western music in China, so why are you bothering us? But yeah, basically most of those conversations were along the lines of, why are you bothering us? But going back repeatedly over, you know, many years, and going back and having the same conversations about licensing, trying to explain to them why they really need to do this. Clearly, you know, there was a bigger play with what was happening with the Chinese government, and IP and copyright was all happening. But you could see there was moves in that direction. There's opportunity. How we were going to make something out of that opportunity, you know, we didn't know, but we knew there was an opportunity, and we weren't going to find the opportunity unless we kept on going back. And Ed built a, you know, really interesting, successful company, you know, in that market. You know, from it, we didn't know what it was. We had to make it up. as we were going along, pretty much what we did with the internet when it started, there was no model, it didn't exist. So we had to create something. We're trying to create something which hopefully wasn't going to be too wrong, which would cause a problem for us down the line. Martin was always very, very careful about sort of precedents. But someone's got to put something to paper and make it up and start doing things. And I think that's kind of been our approach, certainly in the early days, trying to work out what was the analogues that we can kind of use here. Would this sort of model kind of feel right? Does that look good? I mean, everyone was coming to us and saying, well, it's a 50-50 share between us and you. And, loads of companies are happy to sign up to that. But just 50-50, hang on a second, that isn't how it's going to work. I mean, we've got to pay the artist out of our share. So if it's 50-50, we don't get 50 because we're going to be paying the artist a bit of it. So, having that kind of like the logic in the conversations and the models we were putting in place in those early days are very roughly the models which kind of exist now, roughly in the shares, which are there. And, some of the mechanics, dealing with publishing in those early days, both in China and in the early days of the internet, was like, well, what's this publishing stuff? I mean, we're just giving it to you. You're giving us the music. So
on this note, actually, I want you to segue into something, or I want you to buttress this with what was happening more broadly in the market at that time, which in the independent side of things was Merlin had come into the picture, and this was very much supported by Martin and by Beggars, with the thinking that the independents had the capability to compete on a level playing field with the majors. And, there were, I mean, we could talk for hours, and unfortunately we don't have hours, but, there were political moves that Beggars made during that time. And there were these sort of organizational support moves that Beggars made during this time that I think left the independent community of record labels in a better position collectively than before they started. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or anything you want to sort of add to that characterization.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not just Merlin, but if we take a step back, before then to things like AIM or HYM now in America and the Music Trade Associations, I mean, that was, they were the precursors really. And these organizations, a fair amount down to Martin, really. He was driving the creation of these entities that could really represent independent rights. Previously in the UK, the BPI had kind of represented the industry or record labels, but of course it was and is run by and for the majors. So extracting Beggars and other independents did the same at the time out of the BPI to form AIM was the first kind of like move of this collective being stronger than the individual. And during that early time, which was still sort of late 90s, I think early 2000s, I mean, we were experimenting with the first kind of forms of collective licensing for independents. It was a very sort of early version of Merlin in many ways, and we were sort of taking the experience that companies like Beggars had in the area. We had in-demand artists. We had some decent catalogue. We were definitely seen as being a pretty much a must-have for the digital services at the time. Hopefully still are now. But I think being able to take our experience in these deals and be able to share that experience so that the wider community benefits from it, I think is it's been one of Martin's greatest achievements really, and being altruistic, because it could be like, well, let's just keep it all for Beggars, that's our competitive advantage, it's good for us, and everyone can sort themselves out. But that's just not how he sees the world, and he was determined, and still is even more so nowadays, determined to use what Beggars achieves and find ways that the greater independent community can benefit from that as well. So we're all stronger together. That's another kind of incredible learning process to be alongside Martin when he was so instrumental in creating these things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, your role changed, and I don't know the exact dates on this, but your role has continued to expand over the years, where you started out as director of digital, you took on a more expansive role, which I believe is your title now, director of commercial. And
Yeah, yeah. It's always a bit fluid at Beggars for these things.
but fluid, okay,
Yeah.
all right. Maybe it's more of a title than a job shift exactly. But
Well, it's just trying to, you know, I mean, I absolutely hate job titles. I really couldn't give tuppence for them at all. But
I know.
apparently they're important, you know, so we have to have them. But you know, I mean, China's a great example. Actually, it's like, you know, going to China and trying to work out what the market is, and part of that was actually doing a physical kind of, you know, licensee type of structure, and we were doing all sorts. It wasn't just like digital, and I think, you know, it was a bit of live and trying to sort of grease the wheels to get our artists out to different parts of the world. So you know, it just become clear that, you know, sure, we can do digital, but actually just doing digital on its own is only part of what we need to provide. We need to, you know, if we don't get our artists into the UK market or into the US market, we're going to struggle to do as well for their careers. You know, so we've got to take the same mentality of that and get them into the Chinese market. Not that we can at the moment, or sort of other places around Southeast Asia or LATAM or wherever it happens to be quite honest. So I think it's just the nature of, okay, well, digital then and the distribution is maybe the foundation, you know, of what we're building, but it is only a layer, and we need to think about the overall kind of like business strategy. Of course, you know, digital now is the lion's share of, you know, ours and everyone else's revenue, so maybe it's kind of more central now, but that's how we're trying to think about things, and not trying to go, well, okay, well, we've got this distribution box and we've ticked it and we're done. It's like, well, okay, we've got that, but how do we make the most of it? And we make the most of it by putting these other parts of the business and sort of layers across there.
Yeah, you know what that reminds me of? Yeah, you know what that reminds me of, Simon? That reminds me when I started at Beggars and was doing digital there, anything that had the word internet in it came to me. If it didn't matter what department it was from, it just, every email got forwarded, probably many times not even read, just forwarded to me. And what you've done is completely deconstruct that. And I have a great deal of respect for the way you've accomplished this and fed it back into, and part of this is just sort of a natural evolution of this, you know, the space and the role of a record label. But I think you've done a super credible job of it. And I guess I'd like to hear you talk about what's, you know, on everybody else's mind right now, which is you know, Web3, the metaverse, gaming. You know, what, maybe take a few minutes and talk about the parts of these structures that are interesting to you, that you are exploring or spending time in at the moment.
Yeah, well, you know, to just tack on to sort of your point, you know, everything internet got sent to you, and you were in that role. And I think I've tried to explain kind of how I see my role in a way that anything that isn't sort of traditional record company business ends up on my desk, and then I try and find it a home. You know, if we can grow it into something which is meaningful, then my strategy is to push that out into either the right part of the business for it to be in, or create a new department that can service it. I'm very much not interested in building a big department, and in fact, every time I've built anywhere near a sort of a department and a number of heads, that always gets deconstructed and pushed out to the business, and then I can't start scratch. So, you know, it's, in some ways, it's a bit like having a bit of a startup with inside Beggars, and as soon as it matures, it's like, well, okay, but it's that's everyday business now, and I'm kind of not interested in that. So find someone else to do that who can do it properly and pay attention to it, and I'll go off and find something else to do. So yeah, I mean, the wave of, you know, Web3, metaverse, you know, whatever it's going to be there is clearly in that area. It's not anything yet. You know, it's lots of ideas and lots of concepts, and lots of people are building stuff, and we want to be trying stuff, and we want to be in this mix, and we want to be learning about it while it's not really that sort of super significant, because once it does get there, we need to be ready for whatever that is. And we're only going to be ready if we're in there and sort of like, you know, getting our hands dirty and probably making a few mistakes, hopefully not too many expensive ones, and trying to make things work. that's kind of what it's all about. It's like, where's the opportunity? Let's find the opportunity. Let's try and work out what it is for us, how we make the most of it. Try not to make too many mistakes. See how it can benefit our artists. And some of it's going to work and some of it won't work. But we do need to kind of be in there as much as possible. But I think back in the internet days, where there was a kind of like there's a fair flow of stuff coming in, but it wasn't kind of insane. It was still really early days. I think with Web3 and Metaverse, it's like, I mean, I could do a handful of meetings with NFT companies every single week of the year, because there's just everyone's popping up, hey, it's NFTs. Maybe it's not quite so hot now. There's still a lot of companies out there doing it. And with the best will in the world, we are a small, medium-sized company. The people that I actually have someone who's working with me in business development for the first time ever, and they started, like 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. So, okay, it's not just me anymore, but it's me and one other person. We're a really small team, and we love to talk to people. We love to hear what's going on out there, but we honestly just can't work with everyone that's coming up. Not that everyone's got the perfect pitch either. Not all of them are right, but even the ones that we like, it's still not possible to work with everyone and do it responsibly, make sure the licenses are constructed properly, make sure that both we and the artists get paid, which is, surprisingly hard sometimes.
There's an operational side to it. In other words, there's an operational side, and it's not infinite. There's work behind each one of these integrations that you try to do.
Well, that's it. And I think, certainly for, new startups, they don't really get what's involved. And it's like, well, if you've got your catalog on a hard drive, just send us that. And it's like, no, things have moved on a little bit since then. We've got a highly specialized and qualified ops team and tech. And, if we want to deliver our catalog to you and ensure that it's correct and updated and the metadata, they're going to need to do a bunch of work to do that. So if they're going to do a bunch of work to do that, we better be sure that we're going to be earning enough out of that to justify it. And sometimes that's just, the reality is it's just not going to work. And,
right.
it's, we'd love to do more with people, but it's just not possible.
Well, I know you're out all over the place, particularly pre-pandemic, and now I'm sure post-pandemic too. And one of the things that I would be remiss in talking about in the few minutes that we have left here, which I wish we could do this twice as long, Tom, but is as part of these explorations that you've done around the globe, there have been a couple components that are really important. Was that a glass of wine I just saw you drinking? Oh, no, it's water. Well, we're going to talk about wine for a second, because anybody who has ever had dinner with you has had it with a glass of wine, and chances are pretty good it's one of the better, if not the best, glass of wine that they've ever had, because wine, and it's one of the things that fascinates me about you is not only this incredibly broad music knowledge that you have and commercial knowledge, but your hobbies. Your hobbies are not just casual hobbies. You have more than a casual interest in wine. Just talk about where that came from. How why?
I mean, I'm just kind of obsessive about whatever it is that I'm interested in, and it started off with music, but I've collected so many things as a kid, and as a large kid now, I'm still obsessive and collect loads of stuff, and one of those things is wine. It's just when I say it like collecting records, really, you've got all sorts of different producers. You've got big producers, you've got small artisan producers, you've got different labels, you've got limited editions. I mean, you're on the hunt for this particular limited version. I mean, you could be talking about, vinyl, you could be talking about wine. I mean, I think it's kind of very, very intersectional on that. So, but I think that's just my character. I'm not really interested in doing something just to do it. I mean, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to put everything into it and throw myself at it and dive into it, because that's the only way I can kind of do things for better or for worse. And I'm not quite sure where wine sort of like lands up on that. I mean, but I mean, the industry's, being around in the music industry and, being around places where people have shared some nice bottles of wine over the years is definitely what kind of like grew that interest, because you find out that some bottles of wine are much nicer than other bottles of wine. and then once you start going down that rabbit hole, and when there's kind of no coming back. And you know, as much as COVID changed things for everyone, but that time being at home, it's like, well, I've always wanted to do a bunch of wine courses that I've never had time for because I'm never around. I'm just going to do a whole bunch of wine courses, you know, evening classes, because I'm at home all the time. So what else am I going to do? So, you know, that just kind of fanned the flames even more, really. So
you told me something once. I hope I'm going to get this right, but I was asking you how you remembered these different bottles of wine, and you made this analogy, and I think this is what you said, either that or I constructed this in my head, but I think you said something about albums. You said it's like albums. You remember where you heard an album, you remember what the album looked like, and you employ a similar tactic around wine, who you drank with.
Yeah, no, it's where you drank it, who you drank it with, what was the thing around the wine, and then you remember, you know, the wine, the smell, the you know, the flavor, you know, as part of your memory bank. You know, very similar, you know, to what you do with a sound. I heard this record. This is where I heard it first. This is who I heard it with. This is what this record reminds me of this moment. So yeah, I think there's just so much similarity. I mean, you know, wine is a craft made by, you know, people. You know, the special people that make wine, that make special wines, have got that extra something, that X factor. There's lots of winemakers out there. There's lots of really highly trained winemakers out there, but very few of those make wine which really has that thing which grabs you. And I think that's very much like musicians. There's a whole bunch of musicians out there, as we all know. Probably most people on this call, I would have thought as well. But very few of those musicians out there make music which is special, which can kind of, you know, affect people's lives, which can affect culture. And you know, even though there's however many 100,000 tracks a day being uploaded to music services, very, very few of those are that important that they're going to be meaningful to people, that you know, that really do create art, which is special. And I think that's the thing which, you know, beggars and the beggars labels and all the people involved in the labels try and find, is those artists which are going to kind of change people's lives. And you know, that's a really beautiful thing to be working with.
Boy, that's beautifully said. And it reminds me that I'll say the last thing I'm going to say here is quick spin back to Los Angeles last weekend, where we were talking about the incredible gift that those of us who work directly with artists or work directly at record labels, and certainly my experience at Beggars, the gift of getting custody is the wrong word, getting to work with this astonishing catalog of music for any period of time is a massive gift in the career of somebody for whom music means everything. I know you feel this way. I certainly feel this way. And as I recall, this conversation came up at our dinner, and pretty much everybody around the table felt the same way. And I think there were a few misty eyes about it. It's a very powerful opportunity to be presented with. And on that note, speed round, real quick. 4 questions, it looks like. Tom asked the first one. What single record release are you most proud of?
I think that's got to be the first Vampire Weekend album, because that was our first US #1 under our own steam, which was an absolute milestone, you know, for the company, getting ourselves on the map. It wasn't quite the first indie #1 for a while, because Merge Records had just done that with Arcade Fire a few weeks beforehand. Kudos to them. But doing Vampire Weekend and our digital sales and our direct sales that we did ourselves was enough to make us #1. And then the ADA, who was our physical distribution you know, at the time, was on top of that. But we kind of said that was the first proper indie #1, because you take ADA out the question, being Warner's, we sold enough records that week to be, you know, and sold enough downloads that week to be #1. And I think getting that was a milestone for Beggars and XL. And it was a personal milestone that those digital downloads had such a fundamental role, you know, in the success of that record. That's absolutely, you know, #1 for me career-wise.
Guilty pleasure band and or record?
Well, I was kind of suspecting this was going to come, and
This is
I
Tom's
can't have a
question.
guilty pleasure. Yeah, I mean, you can't have a guilty pleasure about music. I mean, whatever it is that I listen to because I want to listen to music and I love it. So how can that be guilty? And whether
Well
that is,
said.
latest Taylor Swift album, and I will genuinely listen to. I want to listen to kind of everything. Unfortunately, it's impossible now, but I want to listen to it because I'm curious. Maybe I won't listen to it again. Maybe I'll listen to it 100 times again. There's nothing guilty about that, whoever the artist is.
Indeed. Style of music that you listen to most often at home.
Oh, well, I don't know. It just kind of changes. I know these are kind of wishy-washy answers, really, but I mean, it's sometimes I'll be going through like a real sort of like indie rock, I guess. With the labels that I work with, is definitely going to be up there. When other times I'm on a complete electronic tip, I'm still massively obsessed by Fortet and the music which he makes, and actually the music which Jamie XX is kind of making. They're sort of like similar kindred folks. So I have a big electronic thing going on. And then during sort of like the pandemic and when I was at home a lot, I was listening to a huge amount of more sort of like very chilled, really trying to get that mental level sort of like consistent. So, Oliver Arnold or sort of Neil Strayham and, things in that kind of genre. But then I just go for a burst and it's like, I've got to listen to like every Prince album or every David Bowie album. And actually those two artists, not that you've asked the question, but those two artists are the most important artists in my life, just being the most creative, dynamic. You can listen to, pretty much their whole career all the way through. It's a different album. I mean, they are both my idea of what a perfect artist can be, just total creative geniuses.
Amen to that. Two more very quick ones. Your most memorable concert experience was?
Probably the first big show I went to when I was a kid. I was 14 years old. I think I was 14, it was 13 or 14. I remember my mum took me for my birthday with one of my school friends, and we went to see Electric Light Orchestra at Wembley Arena, and that was a show. That was big show, spaceship. I mean, 13, 14-year-old kids, spaceships, amazing music. I mean, what more do you want? I mean, that will always be, the first time I just went, oh wow, that's what it's really like.
Okay, and you're a Chelsea fan? Do I have that right? No.
You've definitely got that one well wrong. Arsenal Football Club. It's the team in red and white.
I know who it is. I know who it is. I just wanted to see your reaction. All right. On that note, Simon, thank you for this. I wish we could go longer, but everybody's going out of patience. So great. Tom, thanks for the platform. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah. No.
Well,
thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks for having me on. It's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
hey, this was a pleasure. And to the audience, forgive me for whatever problems you had with Zoom today. Zoom was down for the first 30 minutes of this. The people that got in before it started got in, but there were dozens of people blowing me up during it going, what the heck? So nonetheless, our audience that got in was given a treat. And Simon, I knew this was going to be cool. I can go on and on and on and quiz you about other bands. You've inspired me to re-listen to Vampire Weekend when we hang up. I'm going to fire that up on Spotify this afternoon in your honor. And again, just thank you for all the great music. As I said in the outtake or the intro, your fingerprints are all over the soundtrack to my life. And so thank you to you and to Beggars. And Dick, thank you for bringing one of these icons into the room with you today. It's been an awesome pleasure.
My pleasure too.
Yeah.
All right, folks.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Nice.
Hopefully it was fun for you too.
It was. Be nice to each other, be safe, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Great. Thanks a lot.